Right.
All right. Uh, okay, and I'm supposed to put this on speaker view, so it's just uh, me that appears in the screen. Okay.
I think
Well,
that's how you have it. It's good.
okay. You're in there now for me, but I guess
Hmm.
I'm in there for everybody else. Okay. So a little bit about New Jersey Future first. We're a land use policy organization. So we work on things like revitalizing cities and preserving open space and keeping housing affordable and encouraging transportation choices. Um, so how do we get into this work with aging friendliness? Well, as Julia mentioned, and it's hard for me to believe this is 7 years ago now that I started working on this stuff. Um, the Taub Foundation came to us to ask about how well positioned New Jersey is in being able to accommodate people who want to age in place. And I specifically did not call the report aging in place because some places really don't lend themselves very well to aging. And that's what we found out. So that there's two reports really that got this ball rolling with our work on aging friendly communities. The first one, the original report, looked at aging friendly land use patterns. Like, how well is this town set up to accommodate people to age when they can't drive everywhere anymore or they don't want to drive everywhere? So I tried to quantify that. I looked at four criteria, four indicators. One is density. I counted both population and employment per developed acre to basically a measure of how close together are things, how easy is it to get from one thing to another. Are they close enough that you can walk, or are you basically be getting in the car every time you're making a trip? And on a related note, uh, I looked at a mix, whether a place had a mixed use downtown or not, uh, so that it's not just density, but a density of different kinds of destinations, so that you can easily get from one desired destination to another. Not just a high density housing development like a townhouse complex, uh, but where you have a different mix of uses in close proximity. The third thing, I looked at the how well connected is the street network. So does density and mix of uses actually translate into can you walk there? Um, or are there fences and barriers and stuff like that getting in your way? Um, and finally, access to local bus service for local trips that are a little bit too long to take on foot. Um, so those are the four indicators I looked at. And for each one of those, I came up with what counts as scoring well on each of the four metrics. And so the good news is that a little less than a third of all New Jersey residents age 55 or older live in one of the 107 municipalities that scored well on all four of these metrics. And you can see the lighter green, another 6% or so live in one that scored well on three metrics. But the bad news is that about half of the state's population of 55 and older residents, 1.25 million people, live in one of the 312 municipalities that scored well on only one metric or none at all. So in terms of being ready for the silver tsunami, a lot of places aren't ready for it at all. Beyond that, it's more than just how the town is laid out. The second report looked at more specifically the question of housing, whether even if your place is a nice, well-connected street grid with a nice downtown, do you have the kind of housing options that people are going to want as they get older? Do you have the right kind of housing types? Can they afford to stay in town? What does the pedestrian environment look like in terms of how wide the streets are, whether there's continuous sidewalks, how the traffic lights are timed, how fast are the cars generally traveling? So that's what I looked at in the second report. Now, the later phase of the project is actually working with individual municipalities. This is where the partnership part comes in from the title of the conference today. And I'm going to go through, Tanya is really the lead on this stuff, and she'll talk more about it. But what I do, I help her out by assembling a municipal profile ahead of time. And I'm going to use Teaneck as the example. That's one of the towns we've worked with, and it's also where Elizabeth works. So you get to hear more about Teaneck from her. But I'm going to go through the kinds of things that I assemble so that we take these with us when we meet with the towns to get to give them an idea of what what we're seeing about their town, and then get feedback from them. Are we coming away with the right impression from looking at these data items? So first of all, let's look at the age distribution. Teaneck is fairly similar to the state as a whole. It has a slightly higher percentage of residents who are 65 and older, particularly the 65 to 74 range. Overall, it resembles the state pretty closely. In terms of the living arrangements of the 65 and older population, Teaneck has fewer older people living alone than is true in the rest of the state, and it has more 65 and older married couples who are the heads of their households. That's what the turquoise color, that's where the older person, it's their home. The green wedge is older people living with family, but where it's the adult child that owns the home or rents the home. So that's the difference between those two setups. We also look at what percent of people are living in poverty, both in general and 65 and over. You'll notice Teaneck's poverty rate is much lower than the state as a whole, slightly more than half the statewide rate. In both cases, in Teaneck and in New Jersey as a whole, you're slightly less likely to be living in poverty if you're over 65, although the differential is not as great in Teaneck. So whatever factors might be mitigating poverty for older residents at the state level, they're not quite as in evidence in Teaneck. Housing cost burden, what this is what percent of households are paying more than 30% of their income on housing costs. Teaneck and the state overall, both a little over 40% for everybody. At the state level, it's a slightly higher percent for the 65 and older population. In Teaneck, the 65 and older population, there's only a slightly higher percentage of them that are housing cost burdened than for everybody. I mean, New Jersey is one of the most highly housing cost burdened states in the country. So these are high rates for everybody, but in Teaneck, it's not particularly all that much higher for older people. Vacant housing. Teaneck's housing vacancy rate is like less than half of the state. So that indicates a tight housing market. There is some natural level of vacancy with people moving out and moving into a new place and the apartment's vacant for a month or whatever, or when your house is on the market but you've already moved somewhere else. There's a natural vacancy rate, and Teaneck looks like it's pretty well below that. So that is an indicator of a tight housing market. What kind of housing is available in town? In Teaneck, you'll notice the light gray there. A much higher percentage of Teaneck's housing is single family detached. It has about just a little bit less in the larger apartment buildings. That's the green wedge. Units in buildings that have 5 or more units in them. So a little under the statewide average for larger apartment buildings, way more single family detached. And then the other categories, your duplexes, your townhouses, and your smaller apartment buildings, there's way less of that in Teaneck than there is at the state. So what we refer to as the missing middle housing types, they really are missing in Teaneck. But that's the kind of thing you want to know about if you want people to be able to stay in town as they age. Do you have the right kind of housing for them? As a result of all this single family detached housing, Teaneck has a much higher rate of home ownership than the state, almost 3/4 compared to a little under 2/3 for the state. So a lot fewer renters. And probably as a result of the lack of rental housing supply, the median gross rent in Teaneck is about 10% higher than it is at the state level. Okay, and I guess I've got a little bit, I'm not quite up to my 10 minutes, so I can cover this slide too. In terms of it being a partnership, we learn stuff too when we come to talk to the towns. And one of the things I've enjoyed about working with the towns is the ability to ground truth some of my metrics. These 3 places that we've worked with, Teaneck, Westwood, and Somerdale. Somerdale's down in Camden County, for those of you not familiar with it. They all scored very similar to each other on the metrics that have to do with street network connectivity. They're all basically grids, but when you look at them, they look very different. Like I don't know about you, but I look at these three pictures. The one that looks the friendliest to me from a pedestrian standpoint, or even if I'm an older person driving but don't want to drive on high-speed roads, I'm going with Westwood, with the nice street frontage of all the stores. You got continuous sidewalks, on-street parking to shield pedestrians from moving cars, narrow lanes. Um, Teaneck is sort of in the middle of the road. You have your stores fronting on the sidewalk, but you've got 2 lanes of traffic in each direction. So if you're like 80 years old and can't hustle the way you used to, you're going to think twice before crossing that street in the middle of the block or even crossing at the intersection. And then finally in Somerdale, yeah, they have a grid street network, but look at the businesses are all very car oriented. There's big signs out at the edge of the property, no on-street parking. So you have 2 lanes of traffic going in each direction. Not a very pedestrian hospitable environment. They have the right bones to work with to retrofit it, but right now, most people probably wouldn't want to walk there no matter how old you are. So that's the kind of thing that we learn when we go to work with the towns. And that's all I've got. I'm going to now turn it over to Tanya to talk a little bit more about our work with the individual towns.
Tim, thanks Julia for that intro. Let me just get my screen kind of set up. Okay, hi, so I'm going to be describing New Jersey Futures Creating Great Places to Age program and how, with support from the Henry and Marilyn Howe Foundation and the Community Foundation of South Jersey, we've been able to work directly with communities to help them implement aging-friendly land use strategies. And we do this through an engagement process that relies heavily on educating and informing local decision makers, a lot of it with information that Tim puts together, so that they have the tools to make those land use decisions that they need to make with consideration of older residents. And we also are making sure that community members are part of that process. So there are 2 components to our aging-friendly land use implementation process before we can expect a town to go ahead and implement a land use strategy. And the first component or part is that we compile an aging-friendly land use assessment, looking at those features that Tim was talking about. And then the second phase or component is that we go through an implementation planning process with the community. So first, I'll describe how we work with communities to compile that municipal land use assessment. And the assessment evaluates the extent to which the built environment creates barriers or obstacles for people to be able to stay living and active in a community as they age. The first thing that happens is we form an agreement with the town and ask the town to form a project committee comprised of municipal staff and decision makers, as well as members of the community. And it's really critical to have these 2 stakeholder groups convening together so that there's opportunity for alignment on common goals and objectives as we move through the project. It's also really important to have a champion from within the community so that there's someone who will be moving this along from the inside and keeping it relevant, and then also have that broader focus on integrating age-friendly perspectives or having that age-friendly lens on all municipal policies and programs throughout, even after the project that we're working on is completed and done. So our initial step is to have a kickoff meeting with the project team, and that involves education about how community design can affect quality of life for older residents and can affect whether older residents can have access to things like housing and mobility and features that will lower the risk of social isolation or health problems in their communities. And then this is followed by a discussion where the project committee tells us about their community and how they think they fit into that range of age-friendly community design. We also will do a site tour and walk around or drive around the town with the group to examine the existing built features that are on the ground right now in the community. And then all of that information will go into the land use assessment, as well as review of documents and municipal data that I'll talk about in a minute. But one of the first things that we do for our kickoff meeting is we compile a community profile, like Tim was talking about, based on Tim's data. And Tim's land use and demographic profiles is basically a snapshot of the community statistics, and it communicates the need for towns to address how the built environment affects older residents, particularly in terms of things like housing stock and housing cost burden. And, towns are typically already aware of the trends and problems in their towns, but showing them this data helps to validate their interpretation. It provides evidence to support it, and it also helps them to visualize the trends and sort of motivates and galvanizes them. In terms of the education component, we talk about why I'm sorry, I think I advanced the slide too fast. My bad. We're talking about, why this is important right now. And so I'll show this slide to talk about the demographic shift that's been occurring and resulted, in about 30% of the state and of each town being comprised of residents age 50 or older, as Tim talked about. So what this means for towns is that they need to consider the needs of this growing population of older residents. And so that's what we're talking with them about when we're engaging with them. So all of you are probably aware that when there are surveys conducted of older residents, most older residents will typically say that they want to stay in their communities as they age. But this is something that the municipalities haven't really been thinking about or figured out how to tackle. How to enable older residents to remain in their communities, and what do people need or want as they age into the older years of life. So then we'll talk about the built environment barriers that Tim mentioned that can make it harder for someone to age in a community, and that does include the housing costs or the lack of suitable housing type, sprawling development patterns or lack of access to transportation that make people car dependent, and the lack of opportunities for social and physical activity in the community. All of these are important aspects of the built environment that towns need to be thinking about in terms of older residents. So in addition to our state policy work, New Jersey Future works at the local level because it is the municipalities here in New Jersey that have the most control of land use in terms of the development patterns through their local zoning and master plans. So I'll remind the towns of their jurisdiction and this responsibility that they have to be thinking about this. And this slide just shows the mechanisms by which towns can determine the built form that the community takes. These are also the kinds of data that we will review when we do that land use assessment. So it includes things like zoning and master plans, redevelopment plans, any kind of plans, and the land use ordinances and policies in the community. And it really is because it is those decisions that are going to determine ultimately what the built form of the community looks like. And we say, great places don't make themselves. We need to create those great places. So then it's at this point, and then throughout the whole process. But after reviewing this kind of information in the initial kickoff meeting, we'll have a facilitated discussion with the project team where we ask them to share information about their town. So we aren't trying to come in and tell towns what to do, what their aging friendly community should look like. They do need to own this initiative, and then they do know much more about their towns than we do. So we get that feedback from the committee, and then we also solicit public input. So I and maybe members of the project committee also will give a presentation at the governing body and land use board public meetings so that we can get feedback both from municipal leaders and decision makers as well as the public. And often there is a local champion or age-friendly group in the community that can connect with the community at large and get them involved and bring them out to those meetings. So through a series of meetings and discussions, we'll emerge from this process with a sense of the existing conditions and then the goals for the town in terms of the challenges and opportunities for meeting the needs of older residents in the community in respect to the built environment. And this whole process is meant to be iterative and flexible and inclusive. Then we'll compile the land use assessment, and this evaluates these 4 built environment features. So we are looking, like we talked about, whether there's a diversity of housing options in terms of types and costs in the housing stock, access to mobility and transportation, both in terms of transit, but also, the walkability and connectivity among destinations and neighborhoods in the town. We're looking at the extent that there is a mixed use center with a mix of housing and commercial that provides opportunities for people to live near destinations, have social encounters, and complete daily tasks relatively easily to do these things, without having to drive a car. And then we also look at access to amenities and public and open spaces for physical exercise, social engagement, and enrichment. So I'll just quickly run through each of those four with a little description so you get a sense of what we're looking at. And these are the things that we use as indicators for the aging friendliness of the built environment. So for a mixed use center, we are looking for that mix of uses with commercial and residential. So, is there sufficient residential to enable people to live in the downtown and have that access to destinations and create a vibrant town center? And so we're looking not only at what's on the ground, but we're also looking at the land use ordinances and whether there are regulations that prohibit or restrict that kind of compact pedestrian-oriented place that we're looking for. For housing, like we talked about, we're looking for that diversity of housing and particularly the missing middle. So as Tim mentioned, most, for TNET, but also many towns, if not most of the towns in New Jersey are predominantly single family detached housing. So we are looking at the housing stock in terms of, townhouses, duplexes, multifamilies, other types of units that may be more affordable, cost less or easier to maintain or just have a different structure for sort of getting around and living in. We look at transportation, and here we're basically looking at whether somebody has to have a car to get around. Like I said, we're not only looking at whether there's a transit, train station, bus stops, distance to bus stops, but we're looking at the pedestrian environment and the walkability and connectivity among those things. So we look at, specifically the sidewalk conditions, the crosswalks, whether any enhancements are needed, whether it's safe to cross streets at intersections, and particularly paying attention to the downtown, but also looking for an interconnected system or network of pedestrian and bicycle, movement and circulation throughout the town so that people can get to the destinations from neighborhoods. And then we're looking at public and civic spaces and open spaces and green spaces kind of in the same way. Is there an interconnected network of these spaces, and does everybody in the community have access to them? So we look at the inventory of these places, how are they there? Do they exist? And then how easy is it to get from one to another or from neighborhoods to these destinations, and including the downtown. So we use a quarter-mile buffer as sort of a proxy for walking access or pedestrian access, and we'll map that out, and then we'll identify where there may be gaps where certain neighborhoods don't have that access to these amenities in the community. So that's what our assessment is looking at, and then from all that information, we can make a number of recommendations, to fill those gaps or to address certain issues for aging-friendly land use strategies. And then we will move into implementation planning, which is the second phase of our process. And again, we work with the project committee, and we'll hold a workshop to educate about implementation planning best practices. And a main goal here too is to prioritize the recommendations that came out of that aging-friendly land use assessment in terms of the impact and the feasibility for that particular community. So the information that we share at the workshop in terms of education involves the best practices for implementation planning and helps to describe the purpose for what we're doing and why it is important to take this step and what makes an implementation plan successful. So we want to have a plan that is going to be able to or enable towns to act and integrate aging friendliness into their communities going forward. We focus on formulating smart objectives that are actionable so that, again, action can be taken. We will then rank the assessment recommendations based on an impact feasibility. And that's going to be different for every community. So that's why this implementation process is really important, because there isn't sort of a recipe or cookbook recipe for what works. This process is an iterative process, and it should be adapted or changed as needed, and it needs to include a diverse set of inputs. This slide here represents what we'll do to prioritize the land use recommendations. It shows a dot voting exercise, and here each participant is given a limited number of dots, like maybe 3 dots, and they place their 3 dots next to their top 3 assessment recommendations. And then it results in a graphic representation of which recommendations from the land use assessment might rise to the top and might be appropriate for this community to pursue. And this isn't the end all be all, it's sort of the first step to sort of get us moving in a direction of, well, what's going to work here in this town, what's most needed, what's most doable, what's really important here. And then we'll work through that prioritization process, starting with the results of something like the dot voting exercise, and ultimately land on a priority matrix that gives the land use recommendations of the aging-friendly land use assessment a rank of high, medium, or low priority for that community. And as I said, throughout this process, we want to keep everyone in the loop. So again, we'll continue to be giving presentations. We bring the project to the governing body and the land use boards at public meetings, and then we'll make adjustments to that priority matrix based on the feedback that we get from elected or appointed municipal officials, as well as the community at large, public meetings. And then from there, we'll draft an implementation plan that lays out the specific actions, responsible entities, timelines, partners, funding, all of those elements and details to actually get something done, so that the town has that tool to take the first steps to implement the projects that they've identified as being priority projects in their community. And then this also can serve as a blueprint for getting things not only started, but ultimately implemented and completed. And is a tool for the towns to use. So that is where I am done, and I'm going to pass it on to Elizabeth now.
Elizabeth, your microphone is still muted.
Good morning. Sorry
There you
about
go.
that.
No problem.
It's been a very quiet morning in my office today, and just a minute ago, landscapers came and they're leaf blowing right behind my window, so I hope you can hear me all right. I'm going to be talking about developing affordable housing for older adults in Teaneck and the importance of partnerships. I founded a not-for-profit organization called Geriatric Services in 1990. We took over a facility that had been in Teaneck since around 1915, and we did a major expansion and renovation project on that facility, and it's now an affordable assisted living community for 65 low and moderate income older adults. Up until 2009, Brightside Manor was really our sole focus. But we found in those recent years that we were getting an increased number of calls from older adults desperately seeking affordable independent housing. And we really didn't have anything to offer them. Most of the senior housing projects in our area had waiting lists of anywhere from 5 to 7 years, and most were not accepting new applications. So we felt that there was an opportunity for our organization to both grow as an organization, but also meet a growing need in the community. And so we decided we would get involved in developing subsidized senior housing. And the first step was to find a site. So lo and behold, we very quickly found that there was 1.5 acres of vacant land available in Teaneck, never been developed, so it was a clean site. It's 100% in Teaneck, but if you look at the map on the left, where you see Martin Street is in Bogota. So we're right on the border between Teaneck and Bogota, and Martin Street is actually no longer a street. Bogota vacated it many years ago because it really didn't serve the town any purpose, and gave half of it to the gas station on one side and half to the deli owner on the other side. So just keep that in mind, because we're going to come back to Martin Street in a moment. So in 2009, we signed a contract to buy the property, and soon thereafter, we were able to secure commitments for funding from the HUD 202 program, Community Development Block Grant, and the Federal Home Loan Bank of New York's Affordable Housing Program, as well as some other foundation monies were committed to the project. We felt we were fortunate at that time because Teaneck was working on its application to the Council on Affordable Housing. and they did not have enough affordable units to satisfy their obligation. And so they were very anxious to see our project move forward because we would be bringing 62 new units into the community, and helping the town satisfy their obligation. Unfortunately, in 2010, then Governor Christie signed an executive order that basically stopped the Council on Affordable Housing from requiring towns to submit these plans. And they were evaluating the overall approach to promoting low-income housing within New Jersey. And with that, TNEC very abruptly and completely withdrew their support from our project. So at that point, we needed to go through the conventional means to secure zoning approval, which can be a lengthy and challenging process. We had no idea just how challenging it was going to be. And we found ourselves met with tremendous opposition, both from community residents, but also from the town and the zoning board itself. We were told by the zoning board that there was not a need for more senior housing, affordable senior housing. There were the usual concerns around parking, about traffic, property values, and so on. But there were even concerns raised about while we were housing older adults, what if their grandchildren moved into the building and began dealing drugs? So it got pretty crazy, and it was a very long, drawn out, very difficult process. And ultimately, they approved the project, but with a condition that we provide access to the building from the Pagoda side, and that we be able to use Martin Street to come in and out of the building. Now, of course, Martin Street was no longer a street, as I mentioned earlier. It was privately owned, and neither property owner would agree to sell me part of Martin Street or grant me an easement. So it was impossible to move our project forward. We went to court and sued the Township of Teaneck. We lost, unfortunately. I went back to one of the property owners and got him to agree to give me an easement, but because the easement and the improvements on Martin Street would be in Pagoda, we had to go to the Pagoda zoning board, and they were angry with Teaneck by that point for imposing a condition that was impacting their community, and they would not give us approval. And so we went back to court, and this time sued Teaneck and Pagoda. So you can imagine that this raised the price of our project by quite a bit. But ultimately, we were successful. And in 2016, we completed construction of the Brookdale, which is a 62-unit senior building. It's a beautiful building, and it has tremendous amount of community space. And so the town and local neighbors now view the building in a very positive light. They recognize that their fears were unfounded. There's no drug dealing going on in our building. They also recognize that there is, in fact, a shortage of subsidized senior housing. We have a 10-year waiting list to get into our building. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of community space. The building was designed to support aging in place. We've made it a point to really invite the community into this building, to hold meetings so that the community sees it as a valuable resource and indeed part of their community. The one negative is that I think community residents resent that there isn't a larger number of original Teaneck residents in the building, and they wish that we could have given a preference to Teaneck residents. Around the same time that we opened the Brookdale, we launched our Age-Friendly Community Initiative, which is called Age-Friendly Teaneck, funded by the Henry and Marilyn Taub Foundation. And like most age-friendly community initiatives, we're working to build, to make Teaneck more livable for all ages and ensure that it's a great place to grow up and grow old in. We have worked very hard for the last 4 years to engage all segments of our community, the business community, faith-based, social service programs, the healthcare community, parks, recreation, young people, obviously older residents. We've worked hard to educate the community about gaps in services, especially around senior housing options. As Tim mentioned in his presentation, we have lots of single family homes, and seniors would like to see more affordable and manageable options available. We've built a leadership and advisory team that consists of trusted community members, and have made a commitment to the community that as if and when senior buildings are developed, that we will be a leading force behind organizing and mobilizing the community so that Teaneck residents have equal footing in the housing application process. So, whoops. So the so with these new partnerships and relationships, the town of Teaneck has now come to us with a project. There's a site in Teaneck that had been a community center at one time. More recently, it's just been a storage facility for our Department of Public Works. It's a rather rundown, dilapidated building right on Teaneck Road, in a great area with shopping and transportation available. And the town has asked us if we would partner with them in developing senior housing on this piece of property. They are giving the land to us through a 75-year lease. They're committing $900,000 from their Affordable Housing Trust Fund. They originally wanted retail space on the ground floor, but have agreed with us eventually that it makes more sense to have community space on the ground floor, and our local hospital will be donating wellness services. We have a local care management agency that will be providing social programs and support services on site. And this is what we expect it to look like. We are in the process of applying for low-income housing tax credit financing. And if we are successful, we hope to break ground late next year. And this will provide 40 units of senior housing, and again, a nice community space on the ground floor that will serve not just the tenants in the building, but also community residents in the neighborhood. And so the moral of this story is the importance of partnerships, that our Age-Friendly Teaneck initiative has really helped us build relationships with the community and trust. It's also helped to build awareness of the needs of older adults and the need for more housing options for older adults. Teaneck is now our strong partner rather than an adversary, and are in fact talking with us about additional sites and opportunities to maybe create different types of housing, not just affordable, but a range of housing options for older adults. So with that, I will turn the virtual mic back to, I guess, Julia. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I clicked on and off several times. That was a very helpful set of information for everybody here, and I appreciate all of your perspectives on community development and housing that people probably aren't so used to thinking about it that way. And I think that the two presentations to get, well, 3 presentations, but from 2 organizations together really helps to understand why it's important to build a mentality around this kind of development and why it's important, and that people really do need to consider not only their own desires and needs as they specifically individually age in their communities, but what's best for the community as a whole, and what makes it possible for a variety of levels of economic income and physical ability levels and all of that to safely and successfully age in the community. So I want to present a couple of questions to all of you that came up in the chat, and see what we can come up with to help people understand this even better. So there was a question about, let me find this. One question presented by our colleague Emily Greenfield is about the readiness of a community to take on work like this. And she was wondering if, Tanya, you and Tim could speak a little bit about what are some of the benchmarks that communities should achieve before starting an implementation planning project. Like, what are some of the characteristics you're looking for in working with them?
Well, that's a good question. And I think that, I don't know that I've identified specific benchmarks because it can be fluid. So something in terms of like a change of leadership could really, set something off the rails and sort of change direction entirely. So we focus more on sort of like you were saying, building that culture of understanding, and then really trying to embed this into the municipal operations and decision making as a whole, and not really having our eye on any particular implementation project, but kind of moving the town through this this new way of understanding and thinking about community building to them, potentially a new way, So I don't know that I have a specific answer to what particular benchmarks, but I'd like to see that, the elected and appointed officials are on board and support. So we will, in working with the town, seek, first a letter of interest and then a resolution and an actual agreement that they adopt sort of these planning principles that we've identified as aging friendly principles, for them. And so there is that some more support and commitment that's publicly expressed first by the municipal leaders. And then we do want to see that there is some sort of community swelling as well. So we like to get some sort of either existing community group or, one of the towns I'm working with, they say, oh, we don't actually have a seniors group, and maybe we should, think about developing that, or people that are focused on this specifically. So those two components need to come together before they can think about what strategies they want to be implementing.
Yeah, I would say
That's
the local officials being on board goes a long way, and Somerdale being the prime example of that. Most of the towns that we've worked with in North Jersey already have pretty good land development patterns, and the questions are more, do you have the right kind of housing options, and are your sidewalks in a state of good repair? In Somerdale, as you saw in my photo on the last slide, it's pretty suburban, strip commercial oriented place, but the mayor is great and really wants to turn his town into a traditional downtown. So having the mayor on board went a long way when it came time for us to pick a town in South Jersey to work with. We had a couple of options that were similar to the ones we worked with in North Jersey, but David Kuttner and he was Tanya's predecessor, we really liked the idea of tackling a harder problem, a town that would need to do some retrofitting, but we thought it was a great opportunity because the mayor was really fully on board with the whole project himself. So yeah, I guess if there is a benchmark, having the local leadership being at least sympathetic to the project is something I could point to.
That's helpful. That's helpful. We've heard people say that in other sessions throughout the conference regarding that initial support from the community. So this is a question about New Jersey Future's work in general. One person would like to know whether it's a private or a public organization, and if there are fees and costs associated with your engagement with the municipalities in this way, and who is responsible for the fees and costs.
Well, the answer to the first question is no. We're neither public nor private. We're a nonprofit. So
Nonprofit, non-government organization.
yeah, and that should give you a hint as to the difficulties in trying to operate anything on a fee for service basis, because we're technically not supposed to be making money from our operations. So right now, I think Tanya or Julia, you can correct me, but the paying for the fees and services has basically been our grant from TAUB. Like we're not asking for money from the municipalities, I don't think.
Yeah, no, we are grant funded to do this work, but we can, as a nonprofit, non-profitably do a fee for service project similarly. So, yeah, so that sort of points to the difficulty of sort of getting this work done, is that we do need to solicit funding for it. But we are a nonprofit, mission-driven organizations, and our mission is, smart and sustainable, equitable land use policies and practices. So this aligns with our mission.
Thank you, Tanya. Yes, we're exploring different ways of moving forward with this as well, at a more maybe regional or statewide level. So we'll see how that develops over the next short while. Susan Hoskins has a question. I'd be glad to present it for you, Susan, or let you voice it yourself. What do you prefer? Either way?
Either way,
You go ahead. You go ahead. It's important for us to talk about this.
the ageism part.
That's what I was thinking, or if you have
Yeah.
other questions, bring that along too.
It just feels to me like there's an undercurrent of ageism here. You know, we've been talking so much about diversity and issues like that with racism and gender, but there's a strong current of ageism that I think is still highly tolerated in our communities. And it's something that I've run into in working on age friendly. And I'm wondering, you know, it seems like a lot of some communities feel that older adults are a drain on resources. They don't see older adults as an asset. I called Tim out on the silver tsunami term. But, you know, I was told, you know, our community is about youth. It's about growing in the future. It's not, you know, why should we devote resources to seniors? And I wonder if we can address some of these other really exciting ideas like age-friendly housing if we haven't addressed ageism.
I will let the speaker respond to that, but my initial thought on that is that actually the ageism, I think, is lurking out there, but not really. This work is sort of the opposite of that. The whole goal of most of this work is to incorporate older adults into the community, and if the community is willing to do that and is eager to do that, I see that as sort of the opposite of ageism. But I can tell you that there have been people who pushed back, and you heard in the session some not in my backyard mentality, a lot of it that Elizabeth was up against. And that didn't only have to do with the fact that it was going to be older adults living there, but Elizabeth, maybe you can speak to that and tell Susan what your experience has been as far as facing people who have an ageist perspective.
I don't actually, I haven't found that ageism has been a problem in the development of housing, because I think for many people in the community, older adults are less scary than low-income younger people or families. I mean, I think people didn't, the bias with my project was around it being affordable housing and the way it was going to impact property values. And I do think I don't see ageism as a huge problem in Teaneck. I think the town overall values its older adults, and I think the business community values older adults because they're still the people shopping in the local stores. And so again, I think it's harder I think it was more around it being affordable housing or low-income housing. That's where the bias was.
Well, and if anything, when you're building affordable housing, the town wants it to be senior restricted.
Yes.
Because if there's ageism at work, it's usually against school children, because then you got to raise the property tax to pay for educating the kids. So
That's right.
most towns, they don't want any new development at all, first of all. It's not having to do with it being age restricted, but if they have to accept new residential development, they generally rather it be age restricted than be open to families with kids, because God forbid you gotta pay another teacher to educate the kids.
Yeah, that's been my biggest pushback is school age kids, you know, even with ADUs. The reason not to have an ADU is that then that frees up the main home for a family to move in with children, and we don't want that. So that's the ageism that I've experienced mainly, but also there's a concern, I think, rightly so, with municipal, you know, elected and appointed officials to not want to appear to favor one cohort over another, one one group over another group. So I've had some pushback on, well, why should we only be thinking about this older population? And so that's why we do make the point that, well, the things we're talking about are actually going to be better for all ages in the community. But it just so happens that it disproportionately is better, has more of a positive effect for people above a certain age. So ageism is certainly out there in the way that, in our language and maybe our, sort of underlying biases and perceptions in general. But in terms of those municipal land use decisions, I think the ageism is the opposite, more so.
So I would like to take just a moment to introduce everybody to Barbara Dunn, who's joined us today. She is the previous executive director of Patterson Habitat for Humanity, and she's been in this field a very long time of housing in general. So Barbara, what are your thoughts on this, on the ageism question, but in general on the conversation today?
Having spent I worked primarily in Patterson, and Habitat for Humanity was essentially bringing in a middle class to some very devastated neighborhoods. And so I never had the experience of most of my Habitat colleagues who were continuously fighting, not in my backyard, throughout most of New Jersey. That said, I'm now working as a Vista worker. I retired in 2019, and I'm working with the Housing and Community Development Network of New Jersey as a Vista worker, working with New Jersey Habitat affiliates to see if we can increase the production of housing across the spectrum. So I've been intrigued by this conversation as well as the other presentation, and seeing, I've always seen like seniors and veterans as very, as populations, it's hard to come out and speak overtly against. And so I see, for me, I see it as a way to bring in some of the community benefits that, as several people have mentioned, will benefit families and populations across the spectrum. So I think it's, I'm a senior. I live in Hillsdale, so on a personal level, I found this really interesting. And Westwood is my downtown, so I like the shout out to Westwood. But professionally, working with habitats, I think the more that we can show cohesive and sustainable communities should not be seen as a threat, although there is definitely a deep resistance to any kind of change and development. And I'm hopeful that the work that I've been used to, and I've been really impressed with the work of AARP. I was really not knowledgeable at all about all the great things they're doing. I was familiar with the great work of New Jersey Future. And so I think it's a matter of getting those coalitions, where we may be speaking particularly about seniors at one moment, but it's definitely going to benefit across the spectrum, whether it's the population of disabled or whatever. I think the one piece that I am most concerned about, and that people have talked about, as you talked about the project in Teaneck, the underlying racism and resistance. Low income is equated with people of color, is equated with undesirable populations, is equated with fear. And so I think, yes, ageism, definitely something, is there, perhaps a lack of appreciation for the value of seniors. But I think probably the bigger risk that I see in New Jersey and across our country is that, that disease of racism.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out, Barbara. We need to talk about that, the way that we address any negative attitudes, and Elizabeth shared some of that in her presentation, but in trying to coach people to be more inclusive, how do we face these negative reactions and the challenges of people putting up barriers to affordable housing development? Elizabeth, did you have anything else you wanted to add about some of the things that you faced in Teaneck? And I guess we'll try to wrap up in about another minute or two.
Well, I think just as Barbara just mentioned, one of the comments made to me at the zoning board meeting was, what if busloads of people come to Teaneck from Camden looking to get into this building? And of course, if busloads of people had come from Camden, they would have had every right to apply to get into the building. But I think it speaks to, and Teaneck is a fairly diverse community, but it's that fear of the unknown. It's fear, I think it's a bias against affordable housing, and yeah, fear of strangers or, you know, people who are not familiar coming into a community. And I think that's a common theme for any developer of affordable housing.
I think you were able to reduce some of that, though, Elizabeth, in Teaneck because of the success of that first building, and then the township coming to you in the second instance and
And
asking
then
you.
building relationships, and I think that's, I think we've been able to, as I said, we made it a point, Age Friendly Teaneck holds its meetings in our building. So people come in and they see our residents and they see the way the building is run and managed. But as Tim said, you know, communities are more comfortable with senior housing. I mentioned one of the fears was, what if the older adults have grandchildren who move in with them and deal drugs in the building? It was just crazy. But I think the idea of housing families with children for a whole plethora of reasons is a tougher sell in communities.
Yes.
Okay, does anyone else have any burning question they'd like to ask before we close off? And please feel free to reach out to the speakers after this event too. Barbara?
I'd just like to thank the Tao Foundation. You know, I worked with them on a high school summer job opportunity. So I saw them not in the senior context, but I want to thank the Tao Foundation. You've always been there for communities, for New Jersey residents. And, you know, I appreciate the, you know, just the stellar work that you do. So thank you to you and all your colleagues.
Thank you, Barbara. Much appreciated. Emily, did you have anything you wanted to add in? Nice to see you there.
Ditto to the thanks to everybody for your part in this. It's been a really interesting breakout session.
Great, thank you for your questions. Hi, Rini, we're wrapping up. So we had a great conversation and we appreciate everyone's participation. Thanks for joining us, and hopefully we'll see your faces again with us next Tuesday at the final session of the conference.
And
Thank you,
thank
Brittany
you
and
all.
Julia.
Definitely. Thank you all. It's, I hope everyone had a very exciting and enriching conversation. So thank you all to the speakers and thank you all to the attendees. See you next week.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Okay.
All right. Are we all set, Rini? Is that session done? All right. So I'm going to end the meeting for everyone then.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mikhail.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Gerard and Ro. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you,
Julia.
Gerard, Bacall,
No
Rowe.
problem.
All right.
you.
Julia.
Bye.
Thanks, backup team.